Scattered across this nation, there are places abandoned, boarded up, mysterious. I will unlock their doors and make them yield their secrets.
From a people's palace of dreams
I hate a careless man.
that brought glamour and hope to a military hospital that was the birthplace of plastic surgery.
That's a magnificent piece of work.
It is a lovely thing.
This defies all preconceptions and prejudices.
He'd never done that operation before.
Firing.
To a vast Victorian citadel of heroes.
The size of it.
You've got the authorities, you've got the mob. Where's the fire brigade?
In the middle. We've always been in the middle.
To the beginning of the great British seaside resort.
It's all eerily silent now.
How extensive is the sewer system here in Brighton?
About 44 miles.
This will be my hidden history of Britain.
In this program, I'm prizing open the door of a top-secret stronghold from the Cold War.
Ventilation in a gas attack. Whoever was coming here was coming to survive, to live.
To reveal the terrifying reality that faced Britain in a nuclear holocaust.
And these circles were what?
It was anticipated the Russians would drop a nuclear bomb.
This map is absolutely terrifying.
And on this long-abandoned war machine, I'll discover how our Soviet enemy planned to annihilate us.
This submarine is just bristling with torpedoes. One after another could be fired until they could be sure of their prey.
At a time when the entire world stood on the brink of destruction.
We reckoned that our chances of getting to the target were 20%.
20%.
20%.
Today, there's talk of a new Cold War. But 50 years ago, the Soviet Union and the United States were in the middle of a terrifying race to build ever more destructive weapons. I remember, as a child, the moment when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. I'll never forget the fear that flooded through my world. How close did we actually come to nuclear Armageddon? And if World War III had happened, was there any chance that we could have survived? For me, Cambridge University represented learning, tradition, and order. As a student, I fell in love with its hallowed halls and green swards. I had no idea then that just a mile from my college, there was a secret Cold War fortress.
I'm very close to Cambridge railway station, and these are thoroughly desirable residences with their great glass balconies. And here is a building that is completely incongruous. An overgrown building, but the overgrowth does not penetrate the wall because the wall is concrete. And there is not a window to be seen. Whoever built this didn't want anybody or anything going inside. Can't say the door's very welcoming. No doorbell.
This austere concrete box is a nuclear bunker. Built in 1953, it's been abandoned for almost 30 years. Hidden within its 5-foot-thick walls is a secret history of Britain.
Well, the first door was nothing compared to this. 4 great levers in each of the corners to create, I suppose, an airtight seal. And the lock on one side only. Deep steps. Oh, a rabbit warren opens up before me. This fire extinguisher was supplied 17th of September, 1962. So the place is absolutely dated by that artifact. Plan a plant room. Gas-tight damper. gas fan controls, normal ventilation, ventilation in a gas attack. Whoever was coming here was coming for the long term, to survive, to live.
Scattered throughout this labyrinth of corridors and rooms are remnants of a clandestine world. But who were the people who came here, and what were they doing?
National Assistance Board, Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance, Ministry of Labour, and the Board of Trade.
It seems that every single government department had a base here. But why would they come to a bunker in Cambridge?
Knock on the door, police officer, you're on our list, pack a bag, we're leaving now.
Rod Siebert is a former nuclear warning officer. He spent 20 years working in nuclear bunkers.
So with that diagram, are you going to be able to guide us through the building?
I would imagine so. It's a bit of a labyrinth, but we'll do it.
And so we're starting in this thin part of the building, yes?
Yes, in the old Armed Forces headquarters.
And then we'll move through to the wider bit.
Correct, down the steps into the more modern.
Off you go.
After you.
I would have expected a nuclear bunker to be underground. This just doesn't seem very well designed for the purpose.
Yes, an awful lot of people tend to think in terms of nuclear protection being underground. But of course, thick concrete and steel provides a very high protection factor against nuclear weapons, even more so than earth.
So down a sharp flight of steps.
Yes, we're now moving into the much more modern regional seats of government that was built for the eventuality of a nuclear war.
The original bunker was constructed as a military headquarters, but in 1962, the threat of World War III had grown so grave that it was doubled in size to accommodate a new, highly classified mission.
OK, so a regional seat of government, what did they expect to be able to do from this building?
Well, of course, under the Emergency Powers Act, central government would have been devolved to headquarters such as this, where a commissioner would have opened their war book and worked to reconstruct the business of government.
What was a commissioner?
The commissioner was a minister of state, trained and knew that he was going to come here to take up his responsibilities. There was the feeding of refugees, there was the movement of troops, establishing first aid stations so that those survivors could be looked after and eventually pay their taxes. But of course the main purpose was to preserve the offices of state and the bureaucracy of central government, with all of the major offices of government run by people here.
My goodness, even if there was essentially nothing for it to do.
This was one of a network of 12 bunkers across the country, built so that Britain would always have a functioning administration. Each bunker had its own cabinet with a representative from each government department, so that if one or more were destroyed, the others could continue to govern.
This is curious. A plastic window peering into an operations room. A little device. Clock, emergency lighting.
From the Second World War, Britain took pride in its special relationship with America. But what were the consequences of siding with one superpower against the other? Jim Wilson was a young investigative reporter at the height of the Cold War.
Jim, I remember from the early 1960s my family being very scared of nuclear war. Do you think that was a pretty general fear in the country?
Absolutely. We had American nuclear-tipped missiles on bases all the way down the East Coast. Everybody realized that those bases were vulnerable.
The Americans needed missile bases within striking distance of Russia, and they turned to their closest ally. Our Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, struck a deal to allow American nuclear missiles on British soil. But that made us a prime target. So the British government commissioned a secret report to assess just how vulnerable we now were.
The Strath Report was the first real study of what thermonuclear war would do to the UK. That within the first few hours, a third of the country's population would be wiped out. Water supplies would be contaminated, food supplies would run out, massive numbers of people who would be injured.
The Strath report revealed that Britain had more nuclear targets per acre than any country in the world. It concluded that we would be utterly devastated by a nuclear war. Its terrifying findings were shared only with the cabinet. Britain desperately needed to find a way to counter the Russian threat. But could our defences cope with the Soviet Union's vast military might?
Just look at the size of this thing, a terrific length of lethal military machinery.
In 1962, Russia would launch a terrifying new weapon into the world, and it would come closer to our shores than I ever imagined.
Впервые нам загрузили ядерную торпеду.
I'm uncovering the story of how Britain was brought to the brink of annihilation. By 1962, American nuclear missiles on British soil meant that the Russians had us in their sights.
The Medway may seem an unlikely place to continue my Cold War explorations, although today it is suitably murky. But I'm on my way to a Foxtrot-class Soviet submarine, 1960s vintage, a veritable Cold War warrior.
Now moored near Rochester, this Russian submarine was sold off after the collapse of the Soviet Union and brought to Britain in 1994 as a relic of one of the most frightening moments in our history.
My first impression is of a tremendous rusting hulk. There is scaffolding on the conning tower. It has an extraordinary bulbous nose. But just look at the size of this thing. Not for nothing is it called in Russian Bolshaya, meaning large. A terrific length of lethal military machinery.
Russia sent submarines like this into British waters to gather intelligence on our naval strength, and they were packed to the gills with weaponry.
First thing I encounter is the crew accommodation. I'm assuming that maybe 50 guys slept here in bunks, and if they had any trouble sleeping, they didn't have to count sheep, they could count torpedoes.
The Foxtrot-class submarines needed to avoid detection by the Royal Navy.
A room full of instrumentation. And I'm guessing that this is the sonar room. The whole business of submarines is about sound, tracking the sound of the opposing craft, keeping your own sound to a minimum to get the advantage over the enemy.
From here, Russian crews could listen for British submarines as each side tried to find the other in a deadly game of cat and mouse.
We had to be so quiet. We certainly weren't calculating that they might have a nuclear warhead on board.
In 1962, Vice Admiral Sir Toby Freer was stationed on British submarine HMS Astute. His mission was to hunt down Russian submarines hiding in our waters.
You're listening for a passing submarine?
Yeah, just get a bearing on him, but you don't know how far away he might be.
There's a lot of ocean. Could you be pretty sure you'd know about a Russian submarine passing?
Yes, there's a lot of ocean, but this is a very noisy boat. And the Russians had not latched on to the fact how noisy their submarines were.
Which gave you a tremendous advantage.
Yes, but sonar was in its infancy.
Did you regard it as a formidable machine to be feared?
It was the equal of our A-class submarines, and we saw it as such.
British A-class or Amphion class were long-range submarines dedicated to intercepting Russian submarines lurking off our coast.
What do we have here? The ladder that leads to the conning tower. Boy, I don't want to do this too often. Oof. And this would be the periscope with its two handles.
While this deadly duel played out offshore, back on land, our secret network of bunkers prepared for the worst.
Here's some tubes for taking samples. I'm imagining they had to sample their air to ensure that it wasn't being contaminated. And the machinery must have made a good row. The whole room is soundproofed.
Scientists estimated that it would take weeks for the nuclear fallout to drop below catastrophic levels. So how did the government plan to deal with the horrific aftermath of a nuclear strike?
The place was strutting with retired brigadiers and colonels, except we were only allowed our little bit of the jigsaw.
At the beginning of the 1960s, Michael Barton was an ambitious young radio journalist. His broadcasting talents drew him into the secret world of bunkers.
The first thing they said to me was, Barton, we want you to go on a civil defence course. It was all very hush-hush, and I ended up sitting around a huge table with brigadiers and admirals and lots of war ribbons dangling over the table, and this huge map of Britain. Now, this is a smaller version of what we saw.
And these circles were what?
Where it was anticipated the Russians would drop a nuclear bomb.
And, I mean, this map is absolutely terrifying, isn't it? Because
well, it is.
I mean, it's not only major cities, although, of course, there are so many of those. There are so many circles, and they fall upon each other, the intensity of blast.
They said, well, Barton, we want to assign you to one of these nuclear bunkers in the Lake District. Now, just hold on. We've been talking about 4-minute warnings, and I'm in Leeds, and I have a motorbike. I'd probably get there in 2.5 hours.
I find the haphazard nature of these plans genuinely disturbing. Could this concrete fortress cope with the reality of a nuclear war?
Oh, this enormous fan draws in the air from the outside through this enormous shaft here. And here are all the filters. And there is the fan that does the work so that people inside can survive.
This bunker was designed to shield its personnel from deadly gases and nuclear fallout. But were its staff properly prepared for a nuclear war?
When we went down the bunker, it hit us all that this wasn't just media talk, this could be for real.
Peter Linley was a fresh-faced naval recruit when he was sent on a top-secret exercise to a bunker in Dover.
And as soon as we got to Dover, we started asking passers-by where the regional seat of government was.
So you're going around the streets of Dover asking, presumably, about a top-secret facility?
Absolutely, and had no idea it was top secret. When we realised what we were getting involved in, a nuclear bunker, it was quite frightening, really.
In September 1962, Peter was part of a highly classified NATO operation called Forlex 62. This war game was designed to test Britain's capability to withstand a Russian nuclear attack and land invasion.
Peter, does this room mean anything to you with these plastic windows?
Yes, this is rather similar to where we spent most of our time on this particular exercise. My job was to log signal traffic.
What was through the plastic?
There was somebody there, so you would pass the signal across, and then they would dispatch it.
Did you have any excitement while you were there?
Well, on the second day, the commander, he came bursting in with a signal in his hand. And in the signal, he said, nuclear burst in the channel. And he said, how do I know if this is true or not? Well, I thought, well, surely we'd know about it if there was. But he said to me, you go up top now and see if there's anything untoward going on. So I went up top, looking for mushroom clouds and goodness knows what.
I'm dismayed by this disorganisation. Were you?
Yes, I could hardly believe it. From that point of view, it was more frightening than actually being in this bunker.
As a former Secretary of State for Defence, I'm shocked by how shambolic this was. But we weren't alone. NATO found that no European country was properly prepared for a Russian nuclear attack.
And a control panel, which looks incredibly old-fashioned to us.
Britain's response didn't rely on the military alone. Government departments and volunteers were also trained to act in the event of nuclear war.
The noise in here when it was running, all these air vents just hummed constantly.
Mark Sansom worked for the government here in this bunker until the 1990s. Over the last 20 years, he's built an extraordinary collection of Cold War artifacts.
Our main role was to deal with the food distribution post-nuclear strike. We stored items such as these biscuits, which would be handed out to the population after the bomb had gone off. Obviously, this can, dated 1963, still sealed, but we'll flip it open here. It's just like a can of paint. And underneath this bit of paper here,
good heavens,
we have 1963 baked biscuits. Still good.
But you're eating one of these extraordinary historic artifacts.
Lovely.
Well, quite dry.
Yeah, very tasty, though.
In the aftermath of a nuclear strike, how would the personnel in this bunker have distributed the food to those on the outside who'd managed to survive?
What have we got here?
This is a 60s nuclear and chemical suit.
Was this rather flimsy thing supposed to protect you?
Yes, it'll stop the fallout, which causes the problems.
Do you mind if I just slip this on?
No, not in the slightest. An arm there, and an arm there.
Thank you very much.
You put your white gloves on first.
Black gloves on top of white gloves?
Yeah, that's correct.
You certainly wouldn't want to do any of this in a hurry, would you?
Certainly not. How are we doing with those gloves, then? Are they?
Doing quite well. I think you probably lose quite a lot of weight putting this on.
You need to put your hood up as well, Michael, because that's an integral part of your outfit.
Can you just zip me up, please?
Good Lord.
Don't bother being gentle.
There we go, sir. I think you're ready for a nuclear war.
Ah. Go out and discover possibly a completely destroyed land.
This whole plan seems absurd. Was a bunch of civil servants in nuclear suits handing out biscuits really what we needed in the case of a nuclear apocalypse?
Civil service issue furniture, I think.
And if anyone managed to survive, how would they know what to do next? Broadcaster Michael Barton's job was to keep people informed.
So, as far as you understood it, were you to make it to the bunker, what would be your tasks?
There being no other way, no newspapers, no other communications, it was just radio. One of these very military chaps said to me, "Now, Barton, don't forget you've got to keep the morale of the troops high. I've chosen the records for you." And one of my favourites is "I'll Walk Beside You" by John McCormack. Do you remember the tune?
No, but...
Have you ever heard it? Shall we play it?
Let's have a go.
Shall we have a go? Well, I don't know about you, but I get a sense of the macabre when I hear those words.
Listening to that, I was quite transported by the music. The idea that this could have done anything to raise morale is extraordinary.
I've discovered that Britain was woefully underprepared for a nuclear attack. So in September 1962, when a terrifying crisis pushed mankind to the brink of World War III, Britain was at grave risk.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
When Russia stationed nuclear missiles just 90 miles off the American coast, it shattered the fragile peace.
President Kennedy made his speech on television, and we thought, well, this is going to be us.
And as the closest ally of the United States, Britain was in the firing line too. In October 1962, the world teetered on the brink of World War III, and Britain was woefully unprepared. American nuclear weapons were stationed on our soil, while Russian submarines patrolled our waters.
The extraordinary feat with a submarine is this enormous vessel lies undetected on the ocean bed. And the whole business of submarine warfare and anti-submarine warfare is hide and seek, discovering these vessels and trying to destroy them before they can destroy you.
Cutting-edge Russian submarines like this Foxtrot class were at the forefront of Russia's Cold War plans. Unknown to Britain and America, these submarines were secretly armed with a devastating weapon, nuclear-tipped torpedoes. The crew was authorized to fire them if the submarine came under attack, but both the captain and first officer had to agree to launch them.
Now this cabin here may seem very pokey, but actually, by submarine standards, is luxurious. It's just for one person, it has privacy, it has a desk, it has a wardrobe. Only one person lives like that on a submarine, and that is the captain.
In May 1962, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev struck a deal with Fidel Castro, the head of the Cuban government. Russian nuclear missiles would be secretly deployed in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of the United States. Foxtrot submarines would protect these weapons as they were transferred to Cuba by sea.
Lovely. Good.
The full story of the Cuban Missile Crisis is still unknown.
Я Mikhail. Здравствуйте.
But I've managed to track down two Russians who were right in the middle of one of the most dangerous moments in human history.
Хорошо.
They've agreed to share their story.
Я узнаю все, потому что...
Anatoly Andreev had a distinguished career in the Russian Navy, captaining Foxtrot-class submarines.
Впервые нам загрузили ядерную торпеду.
Anatoly's mission was to guard a secret convoy of ships carrying nuclear weapons to Cuba. Retired Commander Felix Brill was deployed to the convoy.
Быть ядерной войне или нет, они возили, конечно, уже, так сказать, и ракетные, кстати, установки.
Russia's secret objective was to get its nuclear missiles within striking distance of the United States. But the US tracked their movements, and a U-2 spy plane photographed Russian missile bases on Cuba. On the 22nd of October, the world watched JFK make an extraordinary confrontational speech.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
He launched a fleet of destroyers and aircraft carriers to intercept the Russian convoy.
Given Britain's extreme vulnerability in the event of a nuclear war, the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, was wary of offending the Soviet Union and unwilling to commit British forces to the blockade of Cuba without UN sanction. But in order to keep his American ally on side, he authorized a secret British intelligence mission to help the US Navy.
Rear Admiral Sir Toby Freer was part of the assignment.
We had just come in from patrol, and then on the Monday, President Kennedy made his speech on television, and we heard him speak, and we thought, well, this is going to be us. And we were sent to sea and set up a barrier patrol off Newfoundland.
A barrier patrol?
Yeah. We had American aircraft cooperating with us. We were there to see if Russian submarines were coming down from their northern fleet, past Iceland, past Newfoundland, down to Cuba. If they wanted to get there as quickly as they could, they would take the shortest possible route.
Macmillan was desperately hoping for a diplomatic solution, but needed to prepare for the worst. Britain had its own nuclear bomb, the Blue Danube, our only independent nuclear deterrent. Unlike the American missiles, it needed to be transported by the Vulcan long-range bomber and dropped directly on its target.
The Russians had an army of 5 million. It's a huge army. They could have overwhelmed Western Europe. The only thing we could do to stop them would have been nuclear.
Wing Commander Peter West served in the RAF for over 30 years before working in NATO intelligence. In 1962, he was deployed to a squadron of Vulcan bombers.
The most important part of my job was to defend the aircraft.
People trying to shoot you down?
Yeah, people trying to shoot us down, and that could be surface-to-air missiles.
You would have had a very long flight, let's say, to Moscow or St. Petersburg or Leningrad. Do you realistically think you could have made it?
We reckoned, and it was all guesswork, that our chances of getting to the target were 20%.
20%?
20%. And if we had gone, there was really very little chance of our getting back.
While Peter and his crew were preparing for action, the Russian convoy out in the Atlantic reached the American blockade. As the Soviet ships drew close, the US Air Force moved to intercept them. Felix Brill's ship was buzzed by the American planes.
Вот тогда я понял, что это, конечно, что это смертельно опасно.
Russia and America stood on the edge of a precipice. One false move could trigger a nuclear apocalypse. As a veteran of 2 devastating world wars, Harold Macmillan understood the grave danger that the world faced. So when President Kennedy called him to discuss the crisis, he proposed a radical solution. An extraordinary recording of that conversation exists.
Hello, Prime Minister.
Hello. What's the news now?
We are continuing the quarantine. The build-up of the sites continues, however.
Would it be worthwhile our undertaking to immobilize our 4 missiles during the conference?
I will. Let me put that into the machinery, and then I'll be in touch with you on that.
Any movement by you may produce a result which will be very good after us all. That's the danger now.
Harold Macmillan's suggestion that American missiles in Britain be stood down was a clever move. It could help to ease the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union and remove Britain from the firing line. But President Kennedy rejected the idea, and Britain's Vulcan bombers were made ready for nuclear war.
There's a couple of mild flying logbooks. 26th to the 28th of October 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis, Squadron at Readiness State 1-5. We went from that to Readiness State 05 and 03.
The engines were running?
Yes, we were that close.
So you saw the big picture, you saw the possibility of annihilation?
We guessed what was going to happen, and we knew that if it did happen, that there'd be very little left of the UK.
All eyes in Britain were now on the Cuban seas, watching the crisis unfold.
Now, this is the business end of the submarine. Here are the torpedoes in their silos. These are actually ready to go. And it just takes one torpedo to sink a merchant ship, even a Royal Navy capital ship, another submarine. And this submarine is just bristling with torpedoes. One after another could be fired until they could be sure of their prey.
In the Atlantic, the United States naval blockade of Cuba had tightened its grip around the island. What the Americans didn't know was that the Russian subs below them were carrying nuclear weapons and authorized to fire them if they came under attack. Suddenly, Russian sub-captain Anatoly Andreev heard explosions.
What was it like to have explosives dropped near your submarines?
Что это были? Заряды на вскрытие или глубинные бомбы? Определить на слух невозможно, что обстановка очень тяжелая.
The American depth charges were relentless. Foxtrot submarines could store only enough air for 10 days. They'd now been underwater for over a week.
Температура воздуха в одном отсеке, где вы сидите, в торпедном.
The officers on the embattled Russian submarines argued about how to respond to the American aggression.
Did Russian submarines come close to using their weapons?
То есть все торпедные аппараты были приготовлены к стрельбе.
In Britain, Peter West was given the final call-out.
An RAF policeman arrived at my married quarter front door and he said, "Sir, you're wanted at the operations block immediately." So I quickly hugged my wife and said to her, "If this is what I think it is, throw a few things in a bag, get the kids into the car and drive off to your brother in Skye. I think you'll be safe there."
In the Atlantic, the Russian Foxtrot submarines were surrounded by US destroyers. As American depth charges got closer and closer, an argument broke out on the submarine next to Anatoly. The captain wanted to fire his nuclear torpedo, but he needed the consent of another senior officer. After a heated exchange, flotilla commander Vasily Arkhipov refused to sanction the order. That decision pulled us back from the brink of World War III. Behind the scenes, President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev agreed a secret deal. Russia would remove its missiles from Cuba, and America would remove some of its weapons from Europe. Harold Macmillan ordered the Vulcans and Peter West to stand down.
In October 1962, Peter was ready for action. They probably wouldn't have made it to their Russian target, but a few British aircraft would, and they would have had no country to return to. I've realized today how chillingly close we were to annihilation.
Fortunately for the British Prime Minister, our nuclear defences were never put to the ultimate test. This crisis was over, but the Cold War was not. And a new generation wanted to know what would happen to them if there was a nuclear war. They were convinced that these secret buildings held the answer.
My parents broke into a bunker just like this. They were saying the people have to know what's being done in their name.
Britain's brush with annihilation gave birth to a radical new group, the so-called Spies for Peace. These young men and women would challenge the culture of secrecy that ruled our country and lift the lid on the state's secret plans for nuclear holocaust. In October 1962, the world came shockingly close to global devastation. The Cuban Missile Crisis opened the eyes of millions to the terrifying risks of the nuclear arms race. A new anti-war generation was horrified that Britain was brought so close to annihilation. They wanted to expose our country's secret nuclear plans, and they were willing to commit treason to do it.
the Spies for Peace were prepared to risk a lot for what they believed.
These young radicals were intent on revealing the real story of these windowless concrete boxes. Natasha Walter's parents, Ruth and Nicholas, put their lives on the line to expose the truth.
My parents, back in 1963, managed to break into a bunker like this. They were active in the peace movement. They formed this group called the Spies for Peace. There were 4 of them, and they divided up each with a different task. One had a camera, was taking photographs. One of them was copying documents. One of them was drawing a map of the whole area.
What kind of material did your parents get away with?
The names of the people that were down on the list of those who would be let into the bunker. And that's what my parents were protesting about. You can't make plans for a nuclear war where you're basically saying, we're happy for the whole population to be wiped out and keep that secret. The people have to know what's being done in their name.
The Spies for Peace produced a pamphlet revealing the classified mission of the bunkers and the names of those who would be sent there.
This is the document they made.
And duplicate it on an old duplicator. So this is rather exciting for me. This is a Gestapo machine, which I used to use. Should we contravene the Official Secrets Act?
I'd love to see you do that, Michael, yeah.
Oh, and they are spilling through. Isn't that marvelous?
It's great to see that.
This technology may seem basic today, but it allowed them to distribute these state secrets far and wide. It was audacious and dangerous.
They wanted to make 3,000 copies on a machine like this, sent it to newspapers, celebrities, etc., etc. When the document was published, the Daily Express called for capital punishment for the Spies for Peace. Let's not forget that was the culture war of the 60s. The establishment against the youth.
How do you feel looking at your parents now in these photos?
I admire their courage. They didn't do it to aid the Soviet Union. They did it because they believed in liberty and justice for people in the UK.
I was not on the same side as Natasha's parents. Nuclear weapons could not be uninvented, and I believed that we needed them to defend against the Soviet Union that had already colonized half of Europe.
The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed some painful truths. Britain was no longer powerful enough to shape world events or to defend its people from a hostile superpower. Its nuclear weapons were rudimentary and its defences woefully inadequate. The following year, Britain, America and Russia signed a nuclear test ban treaty and pledged to control the nuclear arms race.
Almost 30 years ago, the Berlin Wall was torn down and the world celebrated the end of the Cold War. One writer claimed that that was the end of history, meaning that it was settled, that liberal democracy would be the final form of government for all nations. But since then, democracy has been in decline. Some emerging nations reject it as unsuitable for them, and Britain's relations with Russia have entered another winter. Today, a new history of conflict is being written, much of it deeply hidden.
In the next programme, I step inside the People's Palace, an abandoned cinema from the 1930s.
Whoa!
I hate a careless man.
How absolutely spectacular.
To discover how it helped us through our darkest hour.
I remember vividly thinking, he's mine.
Slow, slow. I dread being asked to dance.
And find out what it meant to generations who came here to lose themselves in movies and music.
We danced to meet the girls.
To Karen, love from the Beatles.